Welcome to this session on conducting your research. Within this session, we're going to look at how you select your research participants. This is typically called sampling. We will explore why and how you should go about piloting the methods you're going to use, and about quality assuring your data. But before you can start to measure or collect data, you need to ensure that you have a very clear research question. If you don't, you may find as you progress through your research, you're actually collecting unnecessary information. And then you're going to have to work out which bits of the information you've collected are necessary and which bits you can disregard. So the first stage, and you've covered this already, is around defining your research question. But then how do you collect the data? What types of questions are you going to use? Who are you going to collect the data from? What's your population? What's your sample? And why are we measuring? Why are we collecting this data? It's these big questions we're going to start to address. Let's think first about who we're going to collect the data from. Who are our population and who are the sample? Because these individuals are going to be key to answering your research question. To be able to generalize your research findings to the wider population, you need to select a representative sample. We need to think about the key terms involved in this. The population is the total number of whatever it is you're going to select from. So it could be the total number of teachers within your school. It could be the total number of pupils within the school. That is your population. The sample is the subset of the population, and it's this sample that is going to be included in your research. The sampling frame is the list of units contained within the population from which you are to sample. So it could be based on gender, it could be the number of student records, so i.e. individual students if you like. But it's a method we're going to use, the matrix from which to select. And then the unit of analysis. Is it going to be that we're selecting individuals, organisations, regions, countries? So we need to think about those. Now, some research is very difficult to generalise. Quantitative research, research done in science, is relatively easy to generalise, and it applies to the wider population. However, social science research, for which education falls under that heading, is a lot harder to generalise because of the type of research you're undertaking, the qualitative nature of your research, the fact that you are looking for meaning, for understanding, for situations that are context specific, means it's very much more difficult to generalise to all schools or to all settings. And that's an important thing to bear in mind when framing your research. So how do you select your sample? We have two different categories. We have probability sampling and non-probability sampling. Probability sampling uses random selection so that there's an equal chance of an individual being selected. It's more likely to produce a representative sample. Errors in sampling are kept to a minimum because you are selecting individuals randomly. And there's almost no opportunity for human bias. If you like, you're putting all the names in a hat and randomly pulling them out. Non-probability sampling, individuals are not selected randomly. They will be selected because of some characteristic. They are defined in some way. So for example, they may all be teachers. They may be head teachers. They may be year 7 boys, year 9 girls. They are in a defined category. They are not random individuals. However, there's a risk of bias in the selection, particularly if you select the wrong category of individuals. And the findings cannot easily be generalized. For example, you may find as part of your research that year 9 girls perform better at maths in your school. Now, you cannot make the assumption that year 9 girls in all schools perform better at maths, because the sample you have selected is context specific. It's about your school. So let's have a look at different probability-based methods of sampling. And we're not going to go through all of these, but you can see we have a simple random sample. Everybody's name into a hat, you pull people out randomly. We have systematic sampling, where individuals are grouped into categories or lists, and then we randomly select from there. So it might be all the people whose surnames start with A, and then you randomly select all the people whose surnames start with B, or done by age band. More commonly, with the type of research that we're going to be involved with, we're going to use non-probability sampling. So we might have convenience sampling, and we select those individuals because they are convenient in terms of access to participate in this study. For example, if you're looking at the roles of head teachers in raising standards in education, there are a number of head teachers you could access and talk to, but you could, and probably would, want to talk to your own head teacher because of the convenience. They are there on site. You're probably not going to want to necessarily talk to a head teacher located the other side of the country unless they meet a specific criteria. It might be that we use something like a quota sample, where we have a defined group. We want to access X number of a certain category, X number of heads of art, X number of heads of science. So we are looking for a very defined number of individuals to participate. It might be that we have a snowball sample, where you send your research tool out to a number of selected participants, and then you ask them to suggest additional participants who may participate in your research. So the sample actually starts to increase as time goes on. Now, what you will need to do is think about which is the most appropriate sampling strategy. For a majority of you, it will probably be non-probability sampling, and for some of you it will probably be convenient sampling if the focus of your research is your own institution. So let's think about just how we select individuals, and this is a typical example of using probability sampling, and you can apply some of the principles to non-probability as well. So remember, within random sampling, each individual has an equal chance of being selected. So the key steps are to define your population. It could be the number of students at the university, and I've just put in a random number. It's not actually the accurate number of students. We select the sampling frame, so what are we looking at? In this case, just the total number of student records, rather than a split by gender or by age or programme of study. So decide your sampling size. How many people do you want to participate in your research? Now this will partly depend on the type of research you're going to do, the time scale, and the research instrument that you're going to use. So for this, we're saying, okay, 250 participants out of my 5,000. Now if you just take a minute to reflect on that, what type of research instrument would you use to collect data from potentially 250 participants? It is unlikely that you're going to go around and interview every one of those participants. Even carrying out a focus group is going to be incredibly time consuming and challenging with that number. It's more likely you will send a questionnaire or survey out to those 250 people. So think about your own research. What's your sample size? It may only be 5 or 6. It may be constrained by the organisation and the number of those post holders within the organisation. So for example, if we go back to looking at the role of the head teacher in raising standards, there's only probably one head teacher. You may have to think about, is that appropriate? Or do I actually have to interview a couple of head teachers? Or look at the role of the head and the executive head? Anyway, back to our process here. We've got our sampling fraction. We divide 5,000 by 250 and we get 1 in 20, a 20th. So then you can list all the students in your sampling frame consecutively from 1 to 5,000 in this case, and then you select 250 numbers. Now it might be that you tear up bits of paper and put 250 into, put 5,000 into a bag and pull out 250, or you can get computer programs where if you put in the range 1 to 5,000 and the number you want, in this case 250, it will pull out 250 numbers randomly using an algorithm. So that may be a slightly quicker way of doing it when you're looking at research on this sort of scale. Those are the students, those are the individuals who are going to receive your research instrument. Now you can think about some of these principles if you're looking at maybe the population of students within the school. How many students do you have within the school? Can you just select randomly some of those students to participate in your study? Or do you have to select from a characteristic using probability sampling? For example, year 7s, year 9s, boys, girls. So you need to think about, again, who the sample is, who the population are, who the sample is. It might be within this particular example, we just go around and select every 20th person. That would also give us our 250 participants. Possibly a slightly longer way of doing it though. So things to consider when looking at sampling. As the sample size increases, the sampling error decreases because there's more individuals. Statistically, each individual is less significant. 2 individuals, each individual has a 50% significance. If you have 4 individuals, 25%. So the larger the sample, the lower any errors are. So larger samples, generally higher levels of precision. But that's not always a reflection of how the findings may be generalized. So you just need to be careful. It's always interesting when you watch TV and you see adverts for hair care products. At the bottom of the screen they put the percentage and the sample, and it's always interesting to see the variation. Some manufacturers will look at a couple of hundred participants to get their 80% of people agree that their hair looks better after using this product. Some manufacturers use a relatively small sample, maybe 40, 50, 60 participants, and make the claim that 70% of participants agree that their hair looks better with the product. So again, you can actually see this on telly. Think about the impact of time and cost on sampling. You need to fit this in to your life. You're working, you have a family life, and you're doing this piece of research. So think about where the participants are located and the time and cost of doing that. Do you need to oversample to allow for non-respondents? There will always be individuals who don't respond to your request to participate in research. Even within your own institution, you will get some participants who will not respond to the request. So do you have to then increase the sample size slightly to accommodate this non-response? Often the response rate can be as low as 30%, particularly if you're sending out questionnaires. So 60% of the people you send questionnaires to are unlikely to respond, and you need to think about, what am I going to do? Is that okay? I've sent it out to 10 members of staff, 3 of them have responded. Is that going to give me accurate results? Or do I have to think about measures to follow up? Do I follow up 2 weeks later with another email, another copy of the questionnaire? What do I need to do to try and increase my sample rate or my sample response? Should I actually not go for 10 staff and only get 3 return? Should I go for 30 staff and get 10 return? Is that something you need to consider? Is that feasible? In terms of generalizing your findings, you can only really generalize them to the population that the sample was drawn from. So if you're looking at maths of Year 9 girls in your school and you have a sample of 10 students, maybe you could apply it to all the girls in Year 9 in your school only. You cannot apply it to all Year 9 girls in all schools. So let's think about this in terms of surveys and questionnaires. And actually some of this will apply to interview questions as well. Surveys are an approach to collecting data, and questionnaires a particular type. And they're very common. They're very popular means of collecting data. We can collect standardized data from our sample of individuals. It's a relatively easy tool to administer, and it's great for large-scale data collection. But let's think about the types of questions that we're going to use. And again, this applies to whether it's questionnaires or maybe to interviews. Do we have open questions where the respondent is able to provide whatever information they want? Very useful in an interview situation. What do you think about? It's an open-ended question. Why do you feel that way? You're allowing the respondent to provide whatever information they want. Now, the thing to think about in a questionnaire is how much information are you going to get back from your participants with an open-ended question? Are they going to write you War and Peace, or are you going to get a one-sentence response? And to what value is that response to you in order to answer your research question? In terms of closed questions, we have a limited range of choices. Is today Thursday? Yes or no? It's a closed question. The answer is probably already defined. Alternative types of closed questions: tick one response or select one response. Marital status is a typical closed question. Tick all that apply is a closed question, and you have a list of qualifications and you tick the ones that you hold. We have Likert scales, where we have a range from strongly agree down to strongly disagree. And individuals are asked to rank how they feel about a particular statement. You need to be mindful of Likert scales. If you were to have an odd-numbered Likert scale, statistically many individuals will select the middle option. So they won't have a preference for agree or disagree. And you need to think to yourself, if I select the middle option, or if my participants select the middle option, is that actually going to help me in any way? Or do we really need an even-numbered Likert scale, so there is no middle option? So they have to either go towards the more agree end of the scale or the more disagree end of the scale. We can have rankings, put these in order that you think are most important, and we can have differential questions. We can have attitudinal questions, where we're looking for an individual's view on a particular topic. Should teachers' salaries be increased? Now you could have a closed question for that. You could have a yes/no answer. You could have a Likert scale. Yes, maybe, no. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to get an individual's view, an individual's feeling on a topic. We can have factual questions, name, address, date of birth, postcode, phone number, all those sorts of demographic data that we quite often collect. And that demographic data is actually quite important, so that you can say, as part of your research, of the 10 responses I received, 6 of them were female, 4 of them were male. The average age of respondents was. If that's important to your research, important to the context of your research. We also finally have behavioural questions. How often or how many times do you do that? We can then follow that up with supplementary questions. Why do you do that? So it's very important to think about the types of questions that we're going to ask our participants. Let's think about how we frame the question now. Try and avoid ambiguous terms. Sometimes, often, usually. Do you usually like fried eggs? Do you sometimes eat toast? They're slightly ambiguous because everybody has a slightly different interpretation of usually, or sometimes, or often. So we need to make our questions clear. Avoid long questions. Particularly if you're interviewing individuals, you definitely want to avoid long questions. If the question's too long, there's a chance the participant may forget the beginning of the question. And that's particularly the case in double-barreled questions. What do you think about teachers' pay and working conditions? There's actually 2 questions there. Now there's a chance that a participant may answer one or the other. What we want is for them to answer both. In order that they do answer both, could we take that question and make it into 2 questions? Avoid being too general. What do you think of David Cameron? Is a very general question. And you will probably get very general answers. But remember, you're asking questions for a specific purpose. The purpose being to answer your main research question. If the questions that you are asking are not relevant or are not directly contributing to your main research question, you need to think about why are you asking that question. Avoid leading questions. How bad do you think it is that teachers are being given increased disciplinary powers in the classroom? You're leading the participant to a prejudiced response by saying how bad or how good. Could you reframe it to make it something like, what do you think about teachers being given increased disciplinary powers in the classroom? You're not prejudiced in the response. And that's very important. It comes onto participant biased or researcher biased. Are you biased in the responses by the way in which you ask questions? Avoid difficult or technical language. Again, this goes back to ambiguity and making sure the questions are clear. Avoid double negatives. and ensure that you are asking questions that accurately model and reflect the phenomena that you are exploring. So if you're looking at maths at Key Stage 3, make sure the questions are relevant and accurate to Key Stage 3 maths. You need to also retain participant anonymity. When you move on to your dissertation, you will have to complete an ethics form. And the ethics form will ask you how you are ensuring the anonymity of participants and the organisation is being upheld. For questionnaires, are you going to ask for participant details? If you are going to have to ensure that participants are very clear that while they are completing their name and contact details on your questionnaire, you will not be using that information as part of your research. An alternative is to use some form of ID number and identify and use that as a means of tracking responses. We've already touched upon asking unnecessary questions. People are busy enough as it is without requiring them to answer unnecessary questions. It may be the questions are necessary, but they perceive them to be unnecessary. So again, this goes back to thinking about, well, how do I frame the question? Remember, you want the participant to complete your questionnaire. So start with a simple question. Ease them into the questionnaire. When they have a look at the first page, the first questions, and they see, well, actually, these are quite straightforward. I'll do this. If you ask very complicated questions at the start, there's a chance that they may not respond or may not complete the questionnaire. Think about leaving personal questions until later on in the questionnaire. There's two schools of thought on this. Some questionnaires you will see have personal information at the start because they are relatively simple questions for a participant to respond to. Asking them their name, their date of birth, what subject they teach is a relatively straightforward question for most participants. However, some people strongly disagree with the idea of providing personal information at all, and will look at that and say, well, actually, I don't agree with that. I'm not going to complete the questionnaire. So you've lost that participant. However, if you put personal details at the end, and they've taken the time to complete all the other questions, they may still disagree with the collection of personal data, but given they've invested time in completing that questionnaire, they may still submit it, and you could then still use the responses. So you haven't lost the valuable data that you're actually wanting. Take your time to design the questionnaire. Does it have to be front-loaded? Do you need more information at the front of the questionnaire? And pilot the questionnaire. Pilot your questions. And we're going to come on to piloting shortly. It goes without saying you should avoid causing embarrassment, particularly in interviews or focus groups. They have to be non-threatening. You are requiring, you are asking, you are wanting people to participate in your research based on goodwill. So don't embarrass them as part of the process. There are some criticisms of research, and particularly of quantitative research. And given that you're predominantly doing qualitative research, you can look at the criticisms of quantitative research and see if they apply to qualitative and to your own work. Quantitative research often assumes an absoluteness about the social world and people, and sees reality as measurable and as explainable. There's an answer to everything, we haven't yet found it. Everything is objective, everything can be measured. We can explain everything. Does that apply to qualitative research? Is everything measurable? Can we explain everything? It doesn't count for variables in context or interpretations. Now, our qualitative research is very much about the context. Just because it happens in your school doesn't mean to say it's going to happen in all schools or even the school down the road. It's about interpretation of the situation within the context. In quantitative research, the process is often detached from the reality of the situation. It's about exploring. It's about measuring things. It's independent of the situation. Researchers can still impose their own bias through the design of the research instruments. Are you imposing your own bias on your research? Are you coming at your research knowing in your mind what the answer you would like to find already is? Or are you coming to your research with a completely open mind? You don't know what the answer is. That's why you're researching it. Statistical data can intentionally or unintentionally skew the findings to suit the interests of the researcher or the audience. Remember the statistical significance of having only 3 participants respond to your questionnaire. 66% of participants agreed with. Well, hold on, that's only 2. We can skew the data to meet our own aims. It's always good practice, if you're going to say 66% or 75%, to actually put the number of actual individuals that represents. However, in social science, there's always this tension around how objective our research is. Is it objective because it's all about meaning and understanding and interpretation of what we see and the interactions between individuals? Surely that can't be objective. We can't generalize from that. Wouldn't it be a lot better? Wouldn't it be a lot easier if we just measured things? Think about Ofsted. That is a qualitative process. People are making judgments based on what they see, what they hear, the interactions that they have. Yet they're trying to force that qualitative judgment into a quantitative measure. So we can then have the headlines. 70% of schools are good or outstanding. But is that really robust? It's difficult to measure emotions, thoughts, and feelings. Just because it's difficult to do that doesn't make it any less valid. So think about those as you're framing your research. As part of your process of conducting your research, you need to pilot your research instruments. And research instruments in this context are the broadest sense, whether it's interviews, focus groups, questionnaires, surveys, or any other method that you're proposing to use. But what is a pilot study? It's a test. It's a test of the methods and procedures that you are planning to use prior to you using them. The purpose of conducting your pilot study is to examine the feasibility of the approach before you use this on your main participants. So for example, does your questionnaire, does your interview questions collect the data that you actually need to answer your main research question? So who should be involved in the pilot study? Well, ideally you want the pilot participants to be from the same group as the final participants. So if your research is focusing on teachers, then it seems sensible to have a separate group of teachers, one or two maybe, to pilot your study, to complete the questionnaire, to respond to the interview questions. However, in some instances this may not be possible. If your research involves head teachers and there's a limited number of head teachers that you know and have access to, then you may want your pilot participants to be those who most closely represent head teachers in this case. So it may be that you pilot your tools with deputy heads. So okay, we know we're going to do this pilot study to make sure it all works. We know who we're going to pilot this with, but what are we actually piloting? Well, we're going to pilot the questions. And some of this looks back to what we covered previously around how we frame the question. We're looking for clarity of question, ensuring that there is no ambiguity in the way it's asked. We're not having to provide additional information to participants. We're looking at the order of the questions. Are we asking these questions in the correct order? Or do we need to rejig the order of our questions to make it more logical? Think about the language we use and whether it's appropriate for the target audience, particularly when working with children and young people. Remember, Microsoft Word can check the reading age of your written work if you feel that that's necessary. But key to this is, does the information obtained from the questions help you answer your main research question? If it does, fantastic. If it doesn't, then you need to think about whether you should be asking that question in that way. For questionnaires, think about the layout of the questionnaire or the survey. Is it accessible in terms of layout, or does the page look cluttered? What about your use of colour? Does that make the questionnaire more or less accessible? A lot of people are using web-based tools to develop and then send out their questionnaire. And that's absolutely fine. The thing you need to think about is, with your web-based questionnaire, particularly if it's free, it's potentially going to have lots of advertising around the edges. Is that going to detract from the questions that you are asking? Accompanying this video, there is a chapter from a book by Oppenheim. And what Oppenheim suggests is, if it can be piloted, it should be piloted. Going as far as the quality of the paper, whether an individual got a pre-addressed, prepaid envelope to respond to their questionnaire to. Oppenheim takes it to that level. Now, maybe working within your school, you don't have to go as far as having prepaid stamped address envelopes for participants to return their questionnaire in, if you're using a questionnaire. But think about those issues. Then what? You've piloted, you've got some responses, the questions are all great. Ask the pilot participants to think about the following questions. How did they find the questions? Was the language used appropriate? Did they understand the question, or did they need to seek clarification from you? Were they giving you their honest answer, or were they giving you the answer they think you want to hear? If you're not sure, can you build triangulation into your questions, i.e. asking the question later on a slightly different way? We see this a lot in psychometric questionnaires. You'll go through a number of questions, and some of them will be worded very similarly to a question you may have already answered. And that is about trying to triangulate your response to a question. Now think about whether you need to adjust your questions or your questionnaire or research instrument in order to ensure that it is fit for purpose. If you invest in the pilot study and the pilot process, it will save you time and effort later. Students often think they can bypass this process, this additional section to their research. And then they go and they ask the questions, they gather their responses and find out that a majority of their responses are useless. They do not answer the research question. So then they have to backtrack and go and ask another set of questions. By this time, participants are getting a little bit fed up with constantly being asked to answer questions. So invest in the process now and save yourself a lot of time and effort later on. Okay, the final section. Think about how we're going to assess the quality of your research. We know there's concerns with both quantitative and qualitative research. There's concerns around validity, reliability, and bias, trustworthiness, and authenticity. But what does this all mean? If we think about validity, does the research instrument measure what it sets out to measure? i.e., is it collecting the data necessary to answer your research question? Does an IQ test really measure variations in intelligence, for example? We need to think about internal validity. How can we be certain that X causes Y? It's a causality effect. And this is particularly important when you're writing up your research. How can we be certain that X causes Y? To what extent can your findings be applied beyond your specific context, your specific school? It's unlikely that your research will be applied or can be applied beyond your specific school. And at this level, that's absolutely fine. But you need to think about, are there any generalizations that you can draw from your research? And are these robust? Or are they just applicable to your school? And this goes back to the importance of sampling. The larger the sample, the more generalizable your findings will be. But we also have this ecological validity. Are your findings applicable to everyday situations and settings? i.e., is your research relevant? And it will be, because your research is grounded in practice. It's going to be more relevant than some academic research, some blue sky research that has to be then taken and made applicable to the real world, to the everyday situation. The more you as researchers intervene in the research process, the less ecologically valid your research will become. If you're observing something, if you're observing a class, are you influencing the outcome? Are you influencing what you observe? Are the students particularly well behaved because they know somebody's watching them? It's a form of bias. It reduces the ecological validity. And you need to be mindful of that. Your presence in a class, your involvement in the research process will erode the ecological validity of your work. Could the results of your study be repeated and the same findings obtained? In the natural sciences, in positivist research, we expect to be able to get the same results time after time. Your science teachers will do experiments with pupils. The same results will be gained time after time. That science experiment is reliable, it's replicable, it can be repeated time and time again. If somebody took your research and used the same methods, the same questions, could they get the same findings? It's less likely in social science because it's about the context, it's about the situation, it's about the interaction. Studies in social science, of which education is part of, interpretivist studies, are less replicable. So we need to ensure they are credible from the outset. Is the procedure repeatable? Can we use the same procedure again and again? This issue around reliability and replication questions the consistency of the measures, the indicators that you choose, the questions that you use, and the way in which the questions have been framed. We need to be thorough in our reporting of our methodology, in how we selected our participants, what our sample was. But we need to remember that we will introduce bias. We need to think about the Hawthorne effect, which is where an individual can modify or improve an aspect of behaviour as a response to the awareness of being observed. We touched on this just now. Think about researcher bias. This goes back to the way in which you ask questions. Not just the phrasing of the questions, and we looked at this earlier. How bad do you think, or how good do you think? That's part of researcher bias. But the tone in which you ask the questions, the intonations that you put in them, your body language will all influence the bias that you introduce into the research process. Is your sample of participants unrepresentative? Is it a skewed sample? If it's a convenience sample or a quota sample, it probably is unrepresentative of the general population. It might be representative of that particular sample. That's fine if you acknowledge that. Looking at year 11 maths results for boys in your school, you cannot make generalised statements about the standard of numeracy at age 16 because you have an unrepresentative sample. You need to think about possible misrepresentation in interviews or transcript analysis and the writing up of this. You may possibly in the past have had comments on your written work about cited in. Smith cited in Jones 2012. You have no idea whether Jones misrepresented what Smith said unless you go back and read what Smith said. It's a form of misrepresentation, a form of bias through the writing. You need to be careful that you don't misrepresent what participants say in order to make their responses fit what you want it to say. But think about the authenticity of your research, the wider impact. Is your research fair? Does it represent different viewpoints from within the study or the social setting of the study? Does it allow the reader to better understand the situation, the context? Does it allow the reader to appreciate the perspective of others? Oh, I see why they may say that. Did or does your research act as an impetus to change situations? As a result of my findings of my research, my practice as a teacher or as a leader is going to change slightly because I have a better understanding of whatever this research tells you. Did or does the research empower you or empower others? I know that this is the right way to do things, or a better way of doing things, because I have some empirical evidence to suggest it does. But let's think about triangulation. It's looking at a situation from two or more positions. It's part of the robustness of your research. It increases validity by getting different angles in order to gain a better understanding. Now, it may be that one of those angles is actually the literature. It may be that one is the literature, one is the questionnaire, and one is some interviews you've done as a result of the questionnaire. You've had 10 responses to your questionnaires. In order to triangulate some of those findings, you're going to interview 2 or 3 of those participants. You then need to think about how are you going to select those participants? What questions are you going to ask them? The methods need to complement each other. So if we observe something as part of an observation, or something arises as part of a questionnaire, we can easily check that out by means of an interview or... Okay, so we've had a think about the questions, the types of questions we're going to ask, the way in which we're going to phrase them to get the most out of the precious time we've got with our participants. We've looked at the sampling, how we're going to select the individuals, what the population is, what the sampling frame is, what our sample rate is, so we end up with a group of lucky individuals who are going to participate in your research. We've then looked at the importance of piloting. Now, if your research is multi-phase, i.e. that you're going to do a questionnaire first, you're then going to follow up with an interview. You may find that you are running 2 lots of pilots, because you'll pilot the questionnaire and then later on you'll pilot the interview questions. Now, do the interview questions, are they generated from the findings of the questionnaire? If they are, then the pilot for that will have to run a little later. Invest in piloting. It will save you time and effort later on. Finally, we looked at quality assuring your data. We discussed things around validity. We've also looked at reliability. The thing to bear in mind with research design, research methods, it will form one chapter within your dissertation, usually chapter 3. So you'll have your introductory chapter, which highlights the research question and the context. You will have a literature review chapter. You will then have your research design or research methods chapter. There are an awful lot of resources available for research methods. People build an entire career on research methods. What I would recommend you do is have a look at some of the general research methods books. There's a good one by Robson called Real World Research, and there's a variety by Cohen, Mannion and Morrison on doing educational research. These are good generalist books. They will take you through all the things that have been covered in this session, but also in other sessions that you've been involved with. Remember, the research, the dissertation, is the fun bit. It's the opportunity for you to explore, investigate something that you are actually interested in. That's something that is going to change your practice and change others' practice. So enjoy it, and good luck with your research.